again, everybody. We're honored to have with us now Valerie, Jarrett, Senior Advisor to President Obama. She oversees the Office of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs, chairs the White House Council on Women and Girls, and she is deeply centrally involved in the President's initiative on criminal justice reform. And,
thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. That's a nice story. I appreciate it. Thank you.
As I was saying backstage, this is at the end of what has been a pretty intense day of conversation about the state of policing in America, the state of incarceration in America. And I think part of the intensity comes from the fact that everybody has a human connection to this set of issues. For all Americans, fear of crime, concern about their community, and particularly for people of color, fear often of the police, and some connection sometimes to this system. And I wondered if I want to ask you a bunch of questions about policy, but I wondered if we could start out at the human level.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering whether you have a story.
Yeah, in fact, I have two, which I'd share with you. The first one was when I was about 11. I was in the car with my mom, and we were driving through our neighborhood, and we saw a police car, and the police car was talking to two teenagers from our neighborhood who lived about 2 blocks from where we live. And my mom saw the policeman, and so she said, "I'm going to stop and see what's going on." And I can remember thinking, "Oh, Mom, don't get involved. The police are there. They're handling whatever the problem is." And she said, "No, I need to get out of the car." And I just remember being scared to death when she got out of the car. And she went over and she said to the policeman, "I know these boys. They live right down the street. Leave them alone." And got back in the car. And it really shook me up that my mother was so afraid for them that she needed to get out of the car. And it really kind of messed with my head for a while. And so if you fast forward, when I was taking driver's education, so I was probably about 15, I was taking it about 3 miles away from home. And I take the bus back and forth. I took the driver's ed class, and when I got out of class, I went to the bus stop. So I'm standing on the bus stop, and the skies open up, and it starts pouring down rain, and I have no umbrella, no nothing. I am literally drenched, standing on the bus stop, and a police car pulls up, and I am terrified. I'm just terrified. And the police officers rolled down the window, and they said, "Get in the car." And I thought, well, that's it. Who knows who'll ever see me again. And I get in the car, and they said, "Where do you live?" And I told them where I lived. And then they started driving in dead silence. And I didn't say anything either. And it was like the longest 15 minutes of my life. They pull up in front of my home. And they said, "Have a good day." And so those two stories kind of juxtapose experiences that I had. And thank heavens for the second experience, because the first one really had made me afraid.
It was the first experience that primed you to react the way to the
Yes.
second, or was there something else?
No, it was really just that one experience. And I have said to my mother many times since then, "Why did you intervene?" And she said, "I just did not know what was going to happen to those boys if I didn't stop." Because they didn't have ID. They were asked for their driver's license, but they weren't old enough to have a driver's license. And she said, "I knew I had to protect them, because that's what adults have to do when they see young boys being stopped by the police."
So I know you've been out sort of fact gathering around this constellation of problems. You've been to a juvenile detention facility in LA. You've looked at various reintegration programs. So I'm wondering what you're learning.
Well, I'm learning a great deal. I'm learning about the disparities in our system and how much in need of reform our criminal justice system is. And then I'm also learning about the incredible resilience of the human spirit and people who had the deck stacked against them from the time they were born, who are fighting back and trying to get their lives back on track. And I think I was, so deeply moved by the girls in this detention center, many of who had been abused by their parents from the time they were young children and cast out on the street and got into the inevitable trouble and were telling me what their hopes and dreams were. One of them wanted to be a physician, another one wanted to be a counselor for people who'd been through trauma. I mean, these people who still continue to dream and believe in themselves when society and their families, by every measure, have let them down. And then just yesterday, I was in New York visiting a couple of reentry programs, one called Drive Change, where it's a food truck operator who has hired people and trains them as soon as they leave prison to drive their food truck, take care of the food service inside of the truck, and market themselves by driving around New York in this great truck. And another one, it was called CEO, Center for Employment Opportunity. And both of them work with probation officers to reach people as soon as they are released from prison. And then just last week, I was in Newark with President Obama when he did a roundtable with a federal judge that he appointed, a probation officer, a business that has been hiring those who've been incarcerated, and several people who told these just extraordinary stories of the adversity they faced in prison and then when they were released from prison, and simple things like only having the clothes that you were wearing when you were incarcerated and they're now 10 years old, or not knowing how to use the internet to find a job, or not having any money at all. Just like no money when you get out of prison and nowhere to live. And the people who help get you into trouble in the first place are right there waiting for you with a nice little safety net if you want to get back in trouble, and just how hard it is to get back on track. And the common theme that I found when I was in Los Angeles and also again yesterday and then in Newark is having children is a great motivator to get your life back on track. And many of these people shared with me that after they had a kid, they just felt like they had to get themselves together and they wanted to be able to provide for their children, but couldn't get a job.
The subject of reintegration has come up again and again today. It's been a long time since this country has seriously invested in that project. So where do you think the money's going to come from now? If there's 600,000 people, I think, a year now being released back into the community.
Yeah, well, so first of all, just some statistics. We have 5% of the world's population, yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. We spent $80 billion on our juvenile justice system, prison system. Not juvenile, the penal system. Well, $80 billion is a good start. So just imagine if we had some of that money available for reentry. And the president gave, I thought, a terrific speech at the NAACP earlier this summer, and he really focused, James, on three pillars. One, the community. What can we do, beginning with early childhood education, to ensure that our children stay in school and we can break that school-to-prison pipeline? What can we do to reform our sentencing? And there's reason to be optimistic now, and we can talk about that in a minute in terms of legislation, so that the penalty actually fits the crime and these mandatory minimums are adjusted and there's some flexibility. And what do we do the day people get into prison to start preparing them for when they're released? And so when they're released, they can actually hit the ground running. And so if we focus on those three pillars, it will save us money in the long term. We'll have people who are reintegrated back into society, working, taking care of their families, being productive members of society, which many of them want to be.
So you mentioned sentencing reform. I mean, how optimistic are you that there can be meaningful reform with this Congress?
I like the way you said that, with this Congress.
You can't do it without them.
It's kind of a leading question. No, we can't do it without them, that's for sure. But I will tell you, I feel very optimistic. And that's not a word I've used very often in the last 7 years when it's come to talking about Congress. But we do have bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. The Senate has already passed out of committee a bill that would provide for sentencing reform. There's a lot of interest in it in the House. And I think we have reached the point where we have a great coalition of stakeholders on the outside who are creating the motivation for Congress to move forward. So it's everybody from, Cory Booker and Van Jones to Koch Industries and more conservative members of the House and Senate. And they actually have coalesced around this, and I think the time is right.
What explains that coalition, do you think? What are the politics right now, particularly on the Republican side? What is driving this interest in doing something about mass incarceration?
Well, I think it's a variety of reasons. And the president had a great meeting several months ago with members from both sides of the aisle, both houses. And surprisingly, I expected the Republicans to focus on the fiscal part of this, but they too were talking about redemption and the fact that you should get a second chance if you've earned a second chance, and the fact that we have a responsibility to reunite people with their families. So the themes were actually remarkably the same on both sides of the aisle.
I mean, that does represent a kind of sea change, because both parties really had embraced the idea of a fairly punitive carceral state. I mean, why do you think the Democrats did, actually, in the first place? going back to the 80s and the 90s.
I think fear, crime rates were going up and people didn't know what to do. And so it was kind of an era of get tough on crime without really thinking through what the societal and financial repercussions of that type of approach were. And I've heard from judges, too, that these mandatory minimums are frustrating to them. They look at individual cases and they go, my hands shouldn't be tied. There are extenuating circumstances. This person needs drug treatment. This person needs mental health counseling. This person needs a whole range of services that would allow them to get back on track as opposed to being incarcerated. And the recidivism rate is so high, and when you start to visit people who are either incarcerated or recently released, you begin to understand why. We still have a lot of hard work to do, but if we could avoid putting them in that pipeline in the first place, that's the best solution.
So what is the emerging consensus? What will meaningful reform look like?
Well, particularly we want to start with nonviolent drug offenders. Begin there where I think everybody can agree that our system is too harsh. And let's figure out how we can give some flexibility in the sentencing. Already, I will say, I should back up to say that the president has begun laying the foundation for this since he took office. He selected Eric Holder as his attorney general because he knew Eric shared his commitment to justice reform, criminal justice reform, and everything from beefing up the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department that had been decimated by his predecessor, to really putting some teeth in our reentry programs, the instructions that we give the U.S. attorneys. The Attorney General Holder told his U.S. attorneys, don't always ask for the maximum, use your discretion. You have prosecutorial discretion. Don't follow the pattern of just going for the most you can possibly ask for. Use some judgment, and that begins to shaping it. Reducing the disparity between cocaine and crack, one that we know has racial disparities particularly, is another way of trying to level our system. And so I think since day one we've been laying the foundation. Data collection, something else extremely important. This morning we had a reentry council that the Justice Department leads at the White House, and we talked about all the different federal agencies that touch reentry. So a lot of the pillars for the progress we're seeing now have been laid since the beginning.
I was really struck by several things the president said in his speech last week in Newark, but one of the things he said sort of in passing was even he at times has despaired about the magnitude of this problem. And listening to you talk about nonviolent offenders, one of the many mind-blowing statistics about our system is I understand that even if we let all the prisoners in federal penitentiary out, we'd still have the highest rate of incarceration in the world because the state system is so huge, and that won't be affected by reform at the federal level. So is this going to be a years-long process? How do you influence what's happening in the states?
Well, we lead by example. And I think if we can pass federal legislation, there's no reason why we couldn't mirror that efforts in the states and counties around the country. And so that would be our effort, is to say, this is what we were able to achieve here. You're right, the lion's share of those who are incarcerated are in the state system. But already we're beginning to see states pass reforms and recognize the financial burden and the terrible toll on the society. And so I think we have momentum going in the states as well as momentum going in Washington. And we have to go down parallel tracks, and we have to learn from each other. We have to see what are the best practices at work.
And one of the warnings we've heard from the stage today is that if we do really begin reducing the prison population, we're going to see crime rising again, and that we're already seeing that actually happen in some cities. There's a boom in the heroin trade in some cities and a lot of crime associated with it. Do you think there's a real risk here that we're watching a very long pendulum swing in a very long arc, and it may just begin, if crime begins to rise, this emerging consensus and bipartisan support will fragment, and we won't really be able to make any progress?
Well, first of all, we are seeing crime going up in some cities. We're also seeing it leveled in others and going down in the third category. So, but I would hasten to add that the Attorney General has been instructed by the President to be very vigilant and go out in the cities where we are seeing crime go up, meet with the mayors and the police chiefs of those cities, figure out what we can do to help showing best practices to bring crime down. But the reason why we have so much support from law enforcement for criminal justice reform, and the President was just speaking to the International Association of the Chiefs of Police in Chicago a couple weeks ago, and they fully support it, and they believe that if we have meaningful reform, it will actually make our streets safer. If you keep people from going to prison in the first place, and they don't get caught up in that system, and they are getting employed, and they have ways of taking care of their family, that brings crime down. And so I think we have all of the stakeholders firmly engaged in this process as a way of keeping our neighborhoods safer and allowing people to lead productive lives.
And one more question for you, and then I have to let you go. You guys have a year left now. Look at the smile.
I wasn't smiling because it's only a year left. I was anticipating his question.
And so what, on this particular issue, what do you think the president wants his mark to be, and how engaged on it do you expect him to be in his post-presidency?
Well, the answer to your first question, I'd start by saying, even though we only have 1 year left, it's the second half of the fourth quarter, but really big things happen at the end of the game, as we all know. And just look at this last year. We've had a terrific year. And if you recall, not that long ago, the press was calling the president lame duck, I think it was. Doesn't feel much like lame duck to me. And so he has decided that building again on the momentum since day one, that he really wants to focus on criminal justice reform writ large, the community, the system itself, and then what can we do, beginning with the announcement he made last week that at the federal level, he has a policy now to ban the box for federal employees, and we're calling on Congress to pass legislation that would require the same for federal contractors. So there's still a lot of work that we can do in the legislative, federal legislation, state legislation, our effort that comes out of the 21st Century Police Report that was recommended to the president, where we're building on strengthening the relationship between the police and the communities that they are there to serve and protect. So I think, as I said, we have an enormous amount of momentum, and everybody in this room can help. I mean, this should not be a problem that's viewed in isolation. It's a problem that touches all of us, and we need to own that responsibility and figure out what we can each do to improve our current system. As for post-presidency, I don't know. I know that the president's committed his entire professional career to justice, bending that arc of the moral universe, and I'm sure whatever he does post-presidency will be consistent with that, those values and the vision that he has for America.
All right, Valerie, Jarrett,
thank you.
Very
Thank
much.
you, everybody.